The political economy of trade policy, which is chapter 10 of Krugman's book, which we are following. Many governments do not base trade policy on narrow cost-benefit calculations. Often, the trade policy which is adopted creates more costs than benefits. Thus, trade policy usually reflects objectives, often political, that go beyond simple measures of cost and benefit. Why is it that governments should not interfere with free trade? So if free trade, why should free trade be left alone? Why should it not be interfered with? We will try to figure out this question. On the other hand, why then do they actually interfere with free trade? In real life, governments ought to leave free trade alone, but instead they actually interfere with free trade. So we will also seek to address this question. So what is the case for free trade? Very few countries have completely free trade. Hong Kong, which is part of China, is the only entity not to have tariffs or import quotas. Most economists hold up free trade as an ideal to be strived towards. Theoretically, at least, free trade avoids the various efficiency losses associated with protection. Many economists believe free trade produces additional gains, like greater product variety. Most economists, even those who have misgivings about fully free trade, believe that free trade is usually a better policy to follow than other alternative policies. So we've already seen this diagram before, and this illustrates the case for free trade, the efficiency case for free trade. When there is free trade, there are no production or consumption distortions as measured by the colored rectangles. In reality, tariffs and quota restrictions cause only about a 1% GDP loss globally. The gains from free trade tend to be smaller for developed countries and larger for developing countries. So for a large country like the US, the proportion of its GDP attributable to free trade is quite small. So if there are tariffs and quota restrictions, the GDP loss itself in a country like the US would be quite small. And globally, it has been seen that tariffs and quota restrictions only cause about a 1% GDP loss. What are the additional gains from trade? It is argued that for small and developing countries in particular, free trade creates gains which are not accounted for by conventional cost-benefit analysis. It has already been seen how free trade leads to integrated markets, which lead to greater production efficiency and greater product variety. It is also argued that free trade offers greater scope for learning and innovation. Removal of quota restrictions also leads to the dissolution of rent-seeking behavior, which is also an additional gain of freer trade. What is the political argument for free trade? A political argument in favor of free trade reflects the fact that a political commitment to free trade may be a good idea in practice, even though there may be better, more narrowly defined economic policies in principle. So remember, we saw that it is possible, depending on the situation, for tariff revenue gains, terms of trade gains, to exceed the production and consumption losses. If that's the case, then it would be better to have some kind of trade restriction, like a tariff. But if you're going to politically argue in favor of free trade, you need to say that free trade is better from a political point of view, even if it is not better from a purely economic point of view. So that's the political argument for free trade. In some cases, deviation from free trade might be welfare increasing. We have just mentioned it. But if the increase in welfare is captured by special interest groups and is used to redistribute income to politically favored entities, then it is probably better to have free trade instead. So this is the political argument for free trade. If the economic gains from restriction are wasted or consumed by special interest groups, then you might as well have free trade. You could make this political argument. Let's look at some intellectually respectable arguments for deviating from free trade. So there's the national welfare argument against free trade, which we've talked about a little. We have already seen that in the case of a large country, which is able to affect world prices through a tariff, the welfare losses of imposing a tariff may be outweighed by the terms of trade benefit, since the tariff would actually lower the price of imports. This is the terms of trade argument for a tariff. In the real world, though, most countries are too small to be able to affect world prices through tariff imposition. We can construct a diagram like this with national welfare on the vertical axis and the tariff rate on the horizontal axis. And so as we increase the tariff rate from 0, national welfare would increase until we reach a so-called optimum tariff rate, T0, at which national welfare is maximized. And if tariffs increase beyond T0, national welfare falls and falls and falls until the tariff rate becomes prohibitive. A prohibitive tariff is one that completely blocks all imports. And then national welfare falls and stays the same. Now, since an export subsidy, so remember, an export subsidy is the opposite of an import tariff. It's a negative tariff. Since an export subsidy worsens the terms of trade, right? So if an import tariff improves the terms of trade, an export subsidy would worsen the terms of trade and would reduce national welfare. So the optimal trade policy in the export sector would be a negative subsidy or a tax on exports, which raises the price of exports to foreigners. And that would be welfare gaining. This is a policy followed by Saudi Arabia and other oil exporting countries. What is the domestic market failure argument against free trade? The case for free trade often rests on cost-benefit analysis conducted using the concepts of consumer and producer surplus. It has been argued that the concept of producer surplus in particular does not properly measure costs and benefits. No markets work perfectly, and domestic failures in the labor and capital markets mean that labor markets don't clear and capital markets don't allocate resources sufficiently. As these are supply-side failures, producer surplus loses its accuracy as a welfare measure.